Walter Dean, an 82-year-old Vietnam veteran, stands trial for protesting the removal of a local veterans memorial. Mocked for his faded uniform and tarnished medals, he faces a skeptical courtroom, alone without competent legal support. As whispers and laughter fill the air, Judge Clara Monroe uncovers Walter's heroic past, revealing a personal connection to her late father, his commanding officer. A fellow veteran's testimony exposes Walter's bravery, shifting the room's perception. With the truth unfolding, will Walter's sacrifices be honored, or will the city's modernization erase his comrade's legacy? The courtroom holds its breath for justice. Subscribe to celebrate courage and sacrifice. Share your stories of misjudged heroes below and type honor to show respect. Join us to keep these powerful narratives alive. Your support makes a difference. The late afternoon sun poured through the tall, arched windows of the county courthouse, casting golden beams that stretched across the scuffed wooden floors, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. The air carried the faint scent of polished oak and old paper, mingling with the tension that hung heavy in the room. Outside the courtroom door, Walter Dean, an 82-year-old veteran, stood as tall as his frail body allowed. His gnarled hands, knotted with arthritis, clutched the handle of his walking cane, a lifeline since his second hip replacement 3 years prior. The cane's polished wood was as much a symbol of his perseverance as the faded army uniform he wore, its green fabric sagging on his thin frame, a relic from his service in Vietnam from 1967 to 1972. Walter squared his shoulders, a reflex born of military discipline that time and age couldn't erase, though his spine protested with a dull ache. Today was no ordinary day. He was here to face charges of disturbing the public peace, a consequence of his one-man protest against the city's decision to tear down the local veterans memorial, a monument that stood as a sacred tether to the men he'd fought beside, the ones who never came home. For this moment, he had chosen to wear his old uniform, its creases etched from years of careful storage in a cedar chest, the sergeant, stripes, and campaign ribbons meticulously pinned to his chest. The fabric, once vibrant, had dulled to a muted olive, and the medals, his Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and others, bore stubborn tarnish no amount of polishing could fully erase. He'd spent hours the night before, hunched over his kitchen table, rubbing at those medals with a cloth, as if shining them could somehow restore the clarity of those long-ago years. Taking a deep breath that rattled in his chest, Walter pushed open the heavy courtroom door. The murmurs of conversation inside faltered, replaced by the weight of curious stares. Heads turned, eyes narrowing as they took in the sight of him, an old man in an outdated uniform, moving with deliberate, halting steps down the center aisle. The rubber tip of his cane tapped softly against the floor, a steady rhythm that echoed his resolve but betrayed the effort each step demanded. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the weight of memory, of purpose. He felt the room's attention like a physical force, pressing against the fragile armor of his pride. "Look at that," a young man in the back row muttered, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "Nice costume, old man." Scattered laughter rippled through the crowd, sharp and careless, like shards of glass. Walter kept his gaze fixed ahead, his weathered face a mask of stoicism, but the words cut deeper than he'd ever admit. They pierced through the pride he'd clung to, stirring a quiet ache in his chest, a reminder of how the world had changed, how the sacrifices woven into his uniform were now fodder for amusement. "Bet he bought those medals on eBay," another voice chimed in, not bothering to whisper. The comment drew more chuckles, and Walter's grip on his cane tightened, his knuckles whitening. He could feel the weight of their judgment, the way it trivialized the blood and sweat embedded in every stitch of his uniform. In the jury box, a group of young professionals, city development office representatives who championed the memorial's removal, exchanged smug glances. One of them, a man in a crisp suit, raised his hand in a mocking salute, prompting another round of stifled laughter. To them, Walter was a relic, a stubborn old man clinging to an irrelevant past, obstructing their vision of a sleek, modern park. As he neared the defendant's table, a young security guard stepped into his path, his posture rigid with authority. "Sir," the guard said, his tone laced with skepticism, "are you sure you're wearing the appropriate attire for court?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken assumptions. Walter's jaw tightened, but he didn't reply. Instead, he reached into his pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out his veteran's ID card. The plastic was worn thin, the photo faded to a ghostly outline, the text barely legible after years of being carried in his wallet. A constant companion, like the memories it represented. He handed it to the guard, who scrutinized it with a frown, his eyes flicking between the card and Walter's face as if searching for proof of fraud. After a long moment, the guard stepped aside, his reluctance palpable. Walter eased himself into the chair at the defendant's table, alone. He hadn't been able to afford a private lawyer, and the court-appointed public defender had met with him only once, a brief, distracted encounter that left Walter feeling like a footnote in the young attorney's overcrowded caseload. The lawyer had barely looked up from his phone, his disinterest as clear as the dismissive glances now aimed at Walter from across the room. From the plaintiff's table, the city attorney, a polished woman in her 40s, her tailored suit and sleek hairstyle screaming wealth and confidence, watched him with thinly veiled contempt. She leaned toward her assistant, whispering something that sparked a shared smirk, their eyes glinting with amusement at the sight of the old man in his outdated uniform. Walter sat still, his hands resting on the table, trembling not from fear but from the effort of containing the storm of emotions that had been brewing since the city announced the memorial's removal 3 months ago. That monument wasn't just stone and metal. It was a lifeline to the brothers in arms he'd lost, the ones whose faces haunted his dreams, whose laughter he could still hear in quiet moments. The city had called it outdated, an obstacle to their grand plans for a modernized park with trendy cafes and walking paths. To Walter, it was a sacred space, a place where he could stand and remember, where the weight of his survival didn't feel so heavy. When he'd chained himself to the monument in protest, his frail body trembling against the cold stone, he hadn't cared about the consequences. He'd only wanted to protect the one thing that still tethered him to those he'd lost. Now, sitting in this courtroom, surrounded by mocking whispers and skeptical stares, Walter wondered if anyone here could ever understand. Could they grasp what it meant to carry the weight of war? To wear a uniform that held the ghosts of friends who never made it back? Could they fathom the cost of the medals pinned to his chest, earned not in glory but in blood, fear, and loss? His eyes drifted to the faded ribbons, each one a story of survival and sacrifice, and he felt a pang of grief for a world that seemed to have forgotten. The bailiff's voice cut through the hum of the room, calling the court to order. Judge Clara Monroe entered, her presence commanding silence as everyone rose. Everyone except Walter, whose arthritic knees refused to cooperate. The effort to stand would have been agony, and he remained seated, his head held high despite the fresh wave of disapproving glances. He could feel the judgment settling over him like dust, but he refused to bow under its weight. This was his stand, just as chaining himself to the memorial had been, and he would face it with the same unyielding resolve that had carried him through the jungles of Vietnam all those years ago. In the harsh glow of the Riverdale courtroom, case number 47,329, City of Riverdale versus Walter Dean, unraveled like a thread pulled from a worn tapestry. The bailiff's voice sliced through the low hum of whispers, declaring the charges, disturbing the public peace and resisting arrest. Walter Dean, an old man whose weathered face bore the scars of time and unspoken grief, sat at the defendant's table. His military uniform, though faded, was pressed with care, its muted green a quiet declaration of a life shaped by duty and loss. The city attorney rose, a woman whose sharp gaze and tailored jacket exuded authority. She smoothed her lapels with practiced ease, as if preparing to deliver an unassailable verdict of her own. Your Honor, she began, her voice clear and commanding, the facts are straightforward. On April 15th, the defendant disrupted Memorial Park by chaining himself to a monument scheduled for lawful removal. When officers attempted to restore order, he resisted, forcing them to cut the chains. Her hand swept toward Walter, a gesture that carried both accusation and disdain. This man has a history of interfering with community events when they clash with his personal beliefs. While we honor our elderly, we cannot allow such disruptive behavior to undermine our city's image, especially as we prepare for a revitalized park to welcome tourists this summer. Her words framed Walter as a stubborn obstacle to progress, and she seemed to savor the clarity of her argument, her confidence bolstered by visions of a modern park that would erase the past in favor of profit. Across the room, Walter's court-appointed attorney, David Collins, squirmed in his poorly fitted suit. Young and visibly overwhelmed, he glanced at his watch, shuffled his sparse notes, and avoided meeting Walter's eyes. His unease was a tangible thing, a mix of frustration and embarrassment at being saddled with a case he felt ill-equipped to handle. When Judge Monroe, a man whose stern demeanor suggested he had heard every excuse in the book, prompted, "Counselor, your response?" David's throat bobbed nervously. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess to confer with my client," he stammered, his voice tinged with desperation. The judge nodded, and David hustled Walter into a side room, his steps quick, as if he could outpace the chaos of the moment. In the dim, cramped consultation room, David's frustration erupted. "Mr. Dean," he whispered fiercely, "you didn't tell me you were going to wear a military uniform to court. This isn't helping. It makes you look like you're putting on a show." His hands flailed, as if he could untangle the mess Walter had created through sheer force of will. Walter's response was soft but resolute, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had faced far greater trials. "It's my uniform," he said, his eyes steady and unyielding. "I earned it." The words were simple, but beneath them lay a torrent of memories, jungles thick with fear, the crack of gunfire, the weight of a comrade's body in his arms. To Walter, the uniform was no costume. It was a second skin, woven with the threads of sacrifice and survival. David exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his disheveled hair. "The evidence is ironclad," he said, his tone shifting to weary pragmatism. "They have photos, videos, police testimony, everything. The best we can do is apologize, promise it won't happen again, and hope they go for community service instead of a fine you can't pay." He leaned forward, his eyes pleading for Walter to see reason, but he was met with a gaze that burned with quiet conviction. Walter's voice was steady, each word a stone laid in a wall of resolve. "I won't apologize for defending a memorial to my fallen brothers," he said. The statement was not defiant, but deeply personal, rooted in a loyalty that David couldn't fathom. For Walter, the monument was more than stone. It was a sacred archive, each etched name a story of courage and loss. To apologize would be to renounce the men who had died beside him, and that was a betrayal he could not abide. David's shoulders sagged, his frustration giving way to defeat. "Then I don't know how to help you," he admitted, his voice cracking with the weight of his failure. "I'm going to ask the court if I can withdraw from the case." It was an admission of surrender, a young man buckling under the stubborn resolve of an old soldier. Walter nodded, his expression softening with a trace of paternal understanding. "Do what you need to do, son," he said, and the words carried a quiet grace that made David's retreat feel all the more inadequate. Back in the courtroom, David approached the bench, his posture defeated. "Your Honor," he murmured, "due to irreconcilable differences in case strategy, I request permission to withdraw as counsel." Judge Monroe's frown deepened, but after a brief exchange, he granted the request. Walter returned to his table alone, the room's collective gaze heavy with judgment. The whispers swelled, a tide of speculation and scorn from those who saw only an old man making trouble. "Probably one of those guys who pretends to be a veteran for handouts," someone sneered. Another added, "My uncle was in Vietnam, and he never pulls stunts like this." The words were daggers, not for their cruelty, but for their ignorance of Walter's truth. Each comment chipped away at the casual dismissal of his service, but he remained silent, his silence a shield forged in harder times. The city attorney, sensing an unchallenged path to victory, allowed a subtle smile to grace her lips. She moved with the ease of someone who knew the game was hers to win. Walter, undaunted, reached into his pocket and drew out a small, faded piece of olive drab fabric. He placed it on the table with the care one might give a holy relic, his fingers lingering on its frayed edges. Hand-stitched into the cloth were the words, "Amiri, Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, 1969. To Walter, it was a lifeline to the past that defined him, a field bandage that had once saved a man's life, a fragment of a moment when survival was a miracle. It was a symbol of brotherhood, of promises kept in the shadow of death. To the onlookers, it was meaningless. Some in the gallery laughed, mistaking it for a cheap bid for pity. A young man in the back row held up his phone, recording with a smirk, eager for a moment that would spark likes and shares. Their mockery was a fresh wound, but Walter's face remained steady, his heart anchored by memories that their laughter couldn't touch. He had faced death in loss. The jeers of strangers were nothing. The city attorney approached the bench, her arms laden with evidence. Photographs capturing Walter's chains, police reports detailing his defiance, and renderings of a park reborn without the memorial. "Your Honor," she declared, her voice resonant with certainty, "the city requests that Mr. Dean be fined to the maximum extent for his disruption and issue a public apology. We also seek a restraining order to keep him from interfering with the park's renovation." She unveiled a large rendering, one side showing the current memorial, a humble stone etched with names, the other a sleek, tourist-friendly park. To her, the monument was a relic of the past. To it was, Walter, a hallowed ground where his brothers' names lived. As the courtroom pulsed with anticipation, Walter sat alone, the fabric before him a testament to a life of sacrifice. No one rose to his side. No one saw the weight of that faded cloth or the man who bore it. No one seemed to care that the old man at the defendant's table had once risked everything for the freedom they now used it to scorn him. Yet in his solitude, Walter clung to his truth, a resolve no fine or order could break, a quiet defiance that burned like a beacon in the fading light of his years. The advertisement had painted the old building in muted, unflattering hues, its angles harsh and uninviting, as if to erase its history in a single frame. Yet the after image gleamed with promise, smiling families basking in a sleek modern space, all traces of the past swept away. No nod was given to those who had once filled that place with meaning, no hint of the sacrifices woven into its walls. "Progress demands change," the city's representative had declared, her voice smooth and resolute, as if the past could be neatly packed away. "Sometimes," she added, "we must respectfully move forward." Walter Dean sat at the defendant's table, his silence heavy in the courtroom's hum. His gnarled hands, etched with the weight of years, rested gently on the faded fabric of his worn jacket. His eyes, clouded yet piercing, stared at some invisible horizon, far beyond the polished wood and sterile walls around him. In his mind, he was not here, not in this room of judgment. He was back in the dense, sweltering jungles, the air thick with the scent of earth and fear. He could feel the weight of a wounded comrade slung across his shoulders, hear the ragged promises he whispered. "You'll make it. We'll get you home. You won't be forgotten." And those words had been his anchor then, a vow carved into his soul. Now, as he sat under the courtroom's fluorescent glare, he felt the sting of failure. He was breaking that promise, and the weight of it pressed harder than any wound he had ever carried. The city attorney's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and dismissive, questioning his honor, mocking his silence. Laughter rippled through the gallery, a careless sound that grated against his stillness. To them, he was just an old man, clinging to relics no one cared about. But to Walter, those relics, those uniforms, those memories were more than fabric or faded photographs. They were the lives of men who'd trusted him, who'd believed in his promises. "If you thought some things should never be ridiculed," the city attorney had said with a smirk, "you could type *respect on their sleek new website." The words felt like a slap, reducing his life's weight to a hashtag. Across the room, Judge Clara Monroe, 58, presided with the calm authority of someone who had steered the county court for nearly 15 years. Known for her efficiency, she moved through cases with a precision that left little room for sentiment. Her no-nonsense demeanor was a shield, honed over years of balancing justice with the demands of a crowded docket. Yet today, something about this case caught her off guard, like a pebble in a well-oiled machine. She glanced at the file before her, flipping through police reports and city ordinances with her usual methodical care. But when she reached the final page, Walter Dean's personal information, her hand froze. "Walter Dean, Sergeant, U.S. Army, Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, 25th Infantry Division." The words hit her like a quiet thunderclap. Her composed expression faltered, just for a moment, a flicker so subtle no one in the courtroom noticed. She looked up, her gaze locking onto the elderly man at the defendant's table. For the first time that day, she truly saw him. Not as a case number, but as a man carrying a history that intersected with her own. The courtroom's low murmur of conversation faded into the background as her mind raced, tumbling back through decades. She saw faded childhood photographs, heard her mother's voice, soft and reverent, telling stories of a father Clara had never truly known. A father who had been more legend than man, his absence a quiet ache she had carried since she was 2. "Mr. Dean," she said, her voice slicing through the courtroom's chatter like a blade. The room stilled, heads turning toward the bench. Walter looked up, startled to be addressed directly by the judge. His weathered face showed a flicker of curiosity, and he nodded slightly. "May I ask you a question?" Clara's tone was steady, but there was a weight to it, a gravity that made the city attorney glance up from her notes, puzzled. "Did you participate in Operation Harvest Wind in 1969? The question hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. The city attorney's confusion deepened, her pen pausing mid-sentence. Walter's roomy eyes widened, just enough to betray surprise. He sat up straighter, his shoulders squaring as if the years had fallen away, revealing the soldier he'd once been. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice quiet but clear, each word deliberate. "I did." "You were with Charlie Company during that operation?" "Yes, ma'am. I was squad leader." There was no boast in his tone, only truth, worn smooth by time. "I don't usually bring it up. Nobody ever asks." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she closed the file, her fingers lingering on its edge. The courtroom had fallen silent, the air thick with an unspoken shift. No one understood why, but they felt it, a current of something deeper than the routine proceedings. Clara's heart pounded, her mind flooded with memories she hadn't touched in years. Her father's name, spoken only in whispers at family gatherings. The stories of his courage, his sacrifice, told through her mother's tears. "My father was Captain James Monroe," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion clawing at her chest. "He was Charlie Company's commanding officer." Walter's face softened, recognition dawning like a slow sunrise. "Captain Monroe, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was a good man, a fine officer." His eyes glistened, and for a moment he was back in that jungle, standing beside a leader who'd inspired trust in the face of chaos. "He never came home from that operation," Clara continued, her words carrying the weight of a lifetime's loss. "I was 2 years old." The silence in the courtroom deepened, a collective holding of breath. The city attorney shifted in her seat, her earlier confidence unraveling. She'd expected an easy win, a straightforward case about ordinances in progress. But now the room felt charged with something she couldn't name, and her carefully prepared arguments seemed suddenly inadequate. With deliberate grace, Judge Clara Monroe rose from her chair. The courtroom watched transfixed as she raised her right hand in a crisp, formal military salute, directed squarely at Walter Dean. A phone clattered to the floor, its owner too stunned to catch it. The smirks and whispers that had filled the room earlier dissolved into confused glances and hushed uncertainty. The city attorney opened her mouth to speak. "Your Honor, I'm not sure." But Clara silenced her with a raised hand, her authority absolute. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," she announced, her voice brooking no dissent. She turned and exited the courtroom, her robes trailing behind her like a shadow of resolve. The tension lingered in her absence, a palpable force that held the room in its grip. Walter remained at the defendant's table, motionless, his weathered face betraying the first cracks of emotion since he'd entered. Pride flickered there, mingled with sorrow and the weight of remembrance. He saw faces in his mind, comrades who'd never made it home, whose laughter and fears he still carried. The salute from the judge, the daughter of his captain, had stirred something deep within him, a validation of the promises he'd made and fought to keep. As the bailiff prepared to escort Walter to a waiting area, a rustle came from the back of the courtroom. An elderly man, leaning heavily on a metal cane, rose shakily to his feet. His voice, though frail, carried a quiet urgency. "I need to speak," he said, his words cutting through the lingering silence. All eyes turned to him, and Walter's gaze followed, his heart catching at the sight of another who might understand the weight of promises kept him broken. Frank Garrison's voice trembled, not just from the weight of years, but from a deep well of emotion that seemed to ripple through the courtroom. It cracked and wavered, yet carried an urgency that demanded attention, cutting through the murmurs and restless shifting of the gallery. "I need to be heard about Walter Dean," he declared, his words raw as if pulled from a place long buried. The bailiff, a stern figure accustomed to routine, paused, his eyes narrowing as he studied the old man. After a moment's hesitation, he gave a curt nod, granting permission for Frank to approach. Each step Frank took toward the front of the courtroom was slow, deliberate, as though he were carrying not just his own weight, but the memories of a lifetime. His worn shoes scuffed softly against the polished floor, and his shoulders, hunched with age, still bore the stubborn pride of a soldier. The gallery fell silent, their earlier whispers and stifled laughter fading as they watched this frail figure command the room. "My name is Frank Garrison," he said, his voice steadier now, addressing the crowd with the resolve of a man who had faced far worse than their judgment. "I served with Walter in C9. I came here today just to watch. Never thought I'd need to speak." He turned, his gaze locking onto Walter Dean, who sat quietly at the defendant's table. Their eyes met, and in that fleeting moment, decades collapsed. It was as if the jungles of Vietnam, the smoke and screams, the weight of survival flickered between them. Frank's hand, trembling with age and emotion, pointed toward Walter. "That man," he said, his voice thick, "pulled me out of a rice paddy under heavy fire. I took shrapnel in both legs, couldn't move, couldn't think. He carried me over a mile to the extraction point." His words hung heavy, each one landing like a stone in the still room. "The medic told me I had less than an hour before I'd have bled out." Frank's voice broke, a crack like splintering wood, and he paused, his chest heaving as he fought to steady himself. The courtroom was utterly still, the weight of his story pressing down on everyone present. "If it wasn't for Sergeant Dean," he continued, his eyes glistening, "I wouldn't have come home. I wouldn't have met my wife, wouldn't have held my children, wouldn't have seen my grandchildren grow." His hand fumbled at his coat pocket, pulling out a worn leather wallet. From it, he withdrew a faded photograph, its edges creased and soft from years of handling. He held it up, his fingers trembling but proud, showing two young soldiers, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, standing in front of a helicopter. Their faces were young, unlined, but their eyes carried the weight of war. "That's us," Frank said softly, "the day before the operation." He looked at Walter again, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Walter never talked about what he did, never sought medals or praise, but I remember. The words seemed to cost him, as if speaking them aloud was both a relief and a wound reopened. The courtroom, once filled with the sharp edge of mockery, was now cloaked in a heavy, respectful silence. The city attorney, who had earlier wielded her confidence like a weapon, sat frozen, her carefully prepared arguments crumbling under the weight of Frank's truth. Her eyes darted to the floor, her earlier bravado replaced by a quiet shame as she realized she had been ridiculing a man whose courage far outstripped her own. When Judge Monroe returned to the bench, her presence was different. Her face was composed, but her eyes were red-rimmed, betraying a struggle to maintain her judicial detachment. In her hands, she carried a folder that hadn't been there before, its contents seeming to weigh on her as much as on the room. "This court will now resume," she said, her voice steady but softer than before. "And I believe we have some facts to clarify." She opened the folder, her fingers lingering on the pages as if they held more than just words. "Sergeant Walter Dean," she began, reading with deliberate clarity, "awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action on June 17, 1969, during Operation Harvest Wind." The judge's voice carried the weight of history as she continued, detailing Walter's actions. "Then Corporal Dean's platoon came under intense enemy fire. With complete disregard for his own safety, Corporal Dean crossed exposed terrain multiple times to rescue wounded comrades. Each word seemed to reshape the room, transforming the atmosphere from one of disdain to something approaching awe. The spectators, who had earlier chuckled at Walter's worn appearance, now sat in humbled silence, their faces reflecting a mix of guilt and reverence. The judge's voice softened as she read further, quoting from a field report written by Captain Monroe, her father. Captain Monroe specifically mentioned Sergeant Dean's extraordinary courage under fire and recommended him for commendation. Judge Monroe paused, her gaze lifting to meet Walter's. "My father wrote those words," she said, her voice catching, "the day before he was killed in action." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the connection between the judge and the man before her now palpable. "My mother told me stories about my father's brave men," she continued, her composure wavering. "I never thought I'd meet one of them in my own courtroom." Walter sat motionless, his weathered face a map of memories. His eyes, deep-set and shadowed, seemed to drift back to those long-ago days. Days of mud and blood, of brothers lost and battles won. For a moment, the room felt crowded with the ghosts of those young soldiers, their laughter and fears frozen in time, watching this reunion unfold across the decades. "I remember your father speaking of you," Walter said, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of truth. "He carried your photo, showed it to us during the rain delays, said you had your mother's eyes." At those words, Judge Monroe's carefully constructed mask slipped. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, and she brushed it away with a quick, almost embarrassed motion. The city attorney remained silent, her earlier arguments forgotten, her confidence undone by the quiet dignity of the man she had mocked. The spectators, too, were changed. Those who had laughed now sat with bowed heads, their earlier scorn replaced by a profound sense of shame. Judge Monroe straightened, her gaze returning to Walter. "Sergeant Dean," she said, her voice firm but laced with emotion, "having reviewed your military record during our recess and heard the testimony offered here today, I find that the context of your actions has been severely misrepresented." She held up the folder, its pages a testament to a truth long overlooked. "This record is a matter of public record, though one that clearly hasn't been properly acknowledged." The room remained silent, the weight of Walter's unrecognized heroism settling over everyone present. What had begun as a routine hearing had become a moment of reckoning, a reminder of the quiet courage that walks unnoticed among us, waiting only for the right voice to bring it to light. On a sweltering June day in 1969, during the relentless chaos of Operation Harvest Wind, Corporal Walter Dean stood at the edge of a battlefield that would define him. His platoon was pinned under a barrage of enemy fire, the air thick with the stench of gunpowder and the cries of the wounded. Fear tugged at the edges of his mind, but a deeper instinct, duty, loyalty, something fiercer, pushed it aside. With no thought for his own safety, Walter bolted across the open terrain, bullets kicking up dirt around him. One month went by and he dragged his wounded comrades to safety, his body screaming with exhaustion, his side burning from a shrapnel wound. Yet he pressed on, coordinating a defense and ensuring the evacuation of his men. 7 soldiers survived because of his actions that day, a feat that would later earn him the Silver Star for gallantry. Years later, in a hushed courtroom, the weight of that day lingered as Judge Clara Monroe recounted Walter's own service. Her voice, steady and deliberate, outlined his accolades: the Silver Star, a Bronze Star with valor, 2 Purple Hearts, and a string of commendation medals earned over 5 years in Vietnam. The room was still, her words carrying the gravity of history. The city attorney, who had entered the proceedings with a sharp tongue and a dismissive air, now sat in silence, her eyes glued to her notes. The confidence she'd wielded earlier had crumbled, replaced by a quiet shame as the truth of Walter's heroism filled the space. Judge Monroe set down the file with a measured gesture. "In light of the evidence and testimony," she declared, "this court dismisses all charges against Sergeant Walter Dean." The gavel's sharp crack sealed her words, but she continued, her voice ringing with conviction. She recommended to the city council that the Veterans Memorial, the one Walter had fought to protect, be preserved as a historical landmark, safe from the bulldozers of progress. For Walter, sitting at the defendant's table, the moment was a quiet triumph. His hands rested on his cane, his face a mask of composure, but those who knew him saw the faint tremble in his shoulders. Pride and pain swirled within him, not just for himself, but for the comrades whose names were etched into that memorial. The judge's tone softened, her words now personal. Sergeant Dean, your courage today in defending the memory of your fallen brothers echoes the bravery you showed 56 years ago. This court honors your service. Then, with a vulnerability that caught the room off guard, she added, "My father served with you. I've only known him through letters and stories, but you were there on a day that shaped those stories. You've given me a piece of him I never thought I'd find. Thank you." The city attorney stood, her movements uncertain. "Your Honor, the city withdraws all complaints against Mr. Dean," she said, then hesitated. "And I personally apologize for my conduct today." Her voice carried genuine regret, a rare admission from someone who'd spent the morning questioning Walter's motives. For Walter, the apology was less about vindication and more about the shift it represented, a crack in the wall of indifference he'd faced. The courtroom's tension dissolved, replaced by a quiet reverence. A young man who'd earlier scoffed at Walter's faded uniform approached with a flushed face. "Sir," he said, his voice shaking, "I'm sorry for what I said. I was wrong." Walter looked at him, his eyes kind but piercing. "Honor doesn't need apologies, son," he replied, offering his hand, "but I'm glad you came back." The young man shook it, his expression a mix of relief and respect, as if Walter's grace had lifted a weight from him. As the crowd thinned, a boy of 10 approached, clutching a notebook like a lifeline. "Mr. Dean," he said softly, "my grandpa was in Vietnam. He collects signatures from veterans. Would you sign his book?" Walter took the notebook with care, his hands trembling slightly, not from age but from the emotion of the moment. "What's your grandpa's name?" he asked. "Robert Jenkins," the boy answered. Walter's face lit with recognition. He signed his name, adding a note below it. "Tell him Whiskey 6 says hello," he said, invoking the radio call sign that had once bound them in the jungle. The boy's eyes widened, a grin breaking across his face as he realized the connection. Outside, under the fading light of the afternoon, a reporter approached. "Sergeant Dean, can you talk about today's ruling?" she asked. Walter spoke quietly, his words measured but heartfelt, about the need to honor those who served, to keep their memory alive. The next day, the local paper's front page bore the headline, "Unnamed Hero Finally Remembered. Court Vindicates Vietnam Veteran." The story spread quickly, picked up by veterans groups across the state. The city council, under growing public pressure, began to reconsider its plans for the memorial. Walter's quiet stand had ignited a spark, a reminder that some battles could still be won with dignity and truth. In a small town where history clung to the streets like morning mist, the community gathered to preserve a veteran's monument, a weathered stone that stood as a quiet testament to sacrifice. The town council, moved by a surge of collective resolve, passed an emergency resolution to protect it, renaming it the Sergeant Walter Dean Veterans Memorial. The decision wasn't just about saving a slab of granite. It was about honoring a man whose life had been stitched together with threads of loss, duty, and unspoken courage. The rededication ceremony came a month later, under a sky heavy with autumn's golden light. Walter Dean stood at the center of it all, his frail frame unyielding despite the ache that gnawed at his aging bones. Pain was an old companion, one he'd carried since the war, but today it took a back seat to the pride swelling in his chest. Hundreds of townsfolk filled the square, their faces a mix of curiosity, reverence, and guilt. Among them were those who had been in the courtroom that day, their memories still sharp with the sting of their own misjudgments. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their murmurs quieting as Walter approached the monument, his steps deliberate, each one a defiance of time and frailty. Judge Monroe was there too, not cloaked in the black robes of her office, but in a simple dress, adorned with a single pin, a tarnished military emblem that had once gleamed on her father's uniform. It was a relic of her own family's sacrifices, a quiet nod to the legacy she carried. Her presence wasn't just ceremonial, it was personal, a bridge between her father's past and the man before her now. She watched Walter with a mixture of admiration and sorrow, her heart heavy with the weight of what she'd learned about him in that courtroom. As Walter reached the newly polished memorial, he gripped a pair of ceremonial scissors, his hands trembling not from age but from the gravity of the moment. With a steadying breath, he cut the ribbon, the fabric fluttering to the ground like a sigh of relief. The crowd held its breath, and then, With a gentleness that belied his weathered exterior, Walter knelt and placed a single red rose at the monument's base. It wasn't for him. It was for the men of his unit, the ones who never made it back, names etched in his memory as clearly as they were now etched in stone. For Captain Monroe, whose courage had inspired him. For all those whose sacrifices had nearly faded into oblivion. In that small gesture, Walter poured out decades of grief, loyalty, and love, a silent prayer for the brothers he'd lost. The crowd watched, some with tears brimming, others with heads bowed, as if the weight of Walter's life pressed down on them all. For years, he'd been just an old man in a faded uniform, dismissed by those who saw only the surface, his slow shuffle, his tarnished medals, his quiet demeanor. But in that moment, surrounded by a community that had finally opened its eyes, Walter found something he'd been searching for since the war ended. Peace. Not the fleeting kind that comes with applause, but the deep, soul-settling kind that comes when your truth is seen, when your burdens are acknowledged, when your name is spoken with respect. Walter Dean had never craved recognition. His fight to save the monument wasn't about claiming glory for himself. It was about ensuring his comrades' names weren't erased by time or indifference. Yet in defending their memory, he'd unwittingly carved out a space for his own story to be told. The townsfolk who once laughed now saw him not as a relic in a costume, but as a hero who had given pieces of himself, his youth, his health, his heart, that could never be reclaimed. His quiet resilience forced them to confront their own haste, their tendency to overlook the unassuming, the ones who carry the heaviest scars in silence. His story lingered in the air like the echo of a distant battle, a reminder that honor doesn't always shout its presence. It often hides in the quietest corners, in the stooped shoulders of those we pass without a second glance. Walter didn't need fanfare or medals polished to a shine. He only needed to be seen as a man who had given everything, who had carried the weight of war long after the guns fell silent. His life was a testament to the truth that those we dismiss most easily are often the ones who have sacrificed the most.